I told you last week that we were going to spend some time between here and Easter talking about the last week of Jesus' life. And one difficult thing about that is that it's hard to do it chronologically because the week before Easter is Palm Sunday, where you kind of want to talk about the triumphal entry. But that happened at the beginning of the week. So I'm going to talk about the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. And then we also have communion that day, which would make you think we could talk about the Last Supper, where communion was instituted. But can't do them both. So I'm going to talk about communion next week, and then we'll talk about the triumphal entry, and then we'll have Easter. I think that's the way it goes. But today I thought we'd talk about the trial that Jesus went through. And I've talked about the trial before Pilate. I think that's a powerful story. It is so indicative of human nature. That Pilate asked Jesus, when Jesus talks about truth, Pilate says, "What is truth?" And I think that could be people today. That's exactly the world we live in, a world that's given up on the idea of truth. And so Jesus' time was very much like our time. And so I think that's a powerful story. But I haven't as often talked about the story of before the Sanhedrin. And so I wanted to go to that. And so I'm going to take this from Matthew chapter 26. And just to set the stage, this was soon after Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, anointed Jesus with perfume. And Judas said, "Why did she do that? We could have sold that. We would have made a lot of money and we could have helped the poor." You know that sometimes people talk about helping the poor and really what they want to do is help themselves? That's what he wanted to do. He was going to help himself to that money. The more money he collected, the more money he could skim off the top. And so he was upset, and Jesus told him to settle down, that she did something beautiful for me. She anointed me for my burial, because Jesus knew he was going to die. That was the whole plan. And then right after that, Judas went out to indicate where Jesus was so that he could be arrested. The Jewish leaders wanted to arrest him, Matthew said, but they were afraid to do it with the crowds around because they were afraid of a riot. You see, the whole thing was they thought Jesus was portraying himself as the Messiah, and everybody in Israel, except for Jesus, thought that the Messiah was going to be a political ruler. First a military general, then a king, to get rid of the Romans and set up the kingdom of Israel. And it would be a wonderful kingdom. And so the people who were supporting Jesus thought that, and they were disappointed when he was crucified. And the people that were against Jesus expected that, and they were doing everything they could stop it, including killing Jesus. But if they arrested him in front of the crowds, they thought, these people will just riot and we'll have the revolution that we want to stop. And so what did they have to do? They had to find out where Jesus was at night, when he was far away from the crowds and vulnerable. And they had to have somebody from the inside tell them where. And so Judas had offered to do that. And he did it for 30 pieces of silver. I know there's stories like Jesus Christ Superstar where they try to rehabilitate Judas or give him a kind of a better motive, that maybe he was trying to force Jesus' hand and start the revolution. I don't think so. I think we're giving him too much credit. Judas was just greedy, and he wanted the money. It seems like he didn't expect Jesus to actually be killed, but he was willing to get him arrested and tried and maybe imprisoned for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus had told them that they would abandon him, that the shepherd would be struck down and the sheep would scatter, and you're all going to abandon me. And Peter said, "I won't abandon you. Even if I have to die, I'll go with you." And Jesus said, before morning, before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny me 3 times. And then they went to pray in the garden. And Jesus, praying at that most difficult point in his life, took his 3 best friends with him, Peter, James, and John, and said, "Pray with me." And all they could do is fall asleep one time after another. That's the setting of this story when we get to Matthew 26:47. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. People wonder, what was this kiss all about? Why did he kiss him? It seems like such an ironic thing to do when you're betraying somebody. But it's probably just meant to seem like a normal greeting. This is probably how the disciples greeted Jesus often. So it was probably meant to preserve his innocence, his seeming innocence. He was trying to just act like it was normal. He just says, "I'm going to go up, I'm going to give him a kiss, you know that's the guy." So that Judas could deny that he had anything to do with this arrest. It seems like Judas wanted to not only get the money for this arrest, but get away with it and still stay in the inner circle. Jesus already knew it, though. At the Last Supper, Jesus had said that one was going to betray him, and they all said, "Is it I? Is it I?" And Judas went to him specifically and said, "Surely you're not talking about me." And Jesus said, "You've said it." Basically, the words mean, yeah, what you said is true. So Jesus already knew. He already knew he was going to do this. And you know what? This is worse than anybody else, isn't it? I mean, other people arrested Jesus, other people beat Jesus, other people crucified with Jesus. But it's a little bit different when you're betrayed by somebody who's supposed to be your friend. I remember, speaking of Jesus Christ Superstar, I remember the line that they gave Jesus right before this, where he said, "The end is always just a little harder when brought about by friends." Jesus knows what it means to be betrayed. If you've ever had a friend who left you, if you ever had somebody that was supposed to take care of you, was supposed to be on your side, and you found out that they weren't, you know that Jesus understands, because it happened to him too. Only a friend can betray. And that's the irony of this kiss. That's why a lot of people are afraid to love others. You know, I think we are built with, our deepest need is the need to be loved. To know that we are unconditionally accepted and loved. That's our deepest need. And so why don't we act on that more often? Why don't we get closer friendships and closer relationships with others? And I think the big thing is we don't trust others. And for good reason. The only people around us are all these sinners. We've all sinned. We're all sinners. And so we're like, can I trust this person? Because if I let them into my life and let them know me, then if they betray me, that'll hurt even worse. And so I think a lot of people live their life like porcupines. You know, they get close to somebody until it hurts, and then they back off. And they say it's like porcupines in a snowstorm. You back off until it's cold, and then you get closer, and then it gets painful, and then you back off. And I think that's why people buy cats, because, you know, they have you ever seen the bumper sticker? The more I know people, the more I like my dog. You know, that's kind of, I think, there is a saying in Washington, D.C., if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. And the idea is you can't trust anybody there. And I think to a lesser extent, maybe, that's true anywhere you live. But that's the danger. And the amazing thing is Jesus chose to love us anyway. Jesus still loved Judas. Even though he knew exactly what he was doing, he still loved Judas. Judas comes up and gives him a kiss. And what does he say? He says, "Do what you came for, friend." Would you call Judas a friend at that moment? I don't think I would. What was the line that Joe Biden used? You pony soldier, you lying pony soldier. I don't remember the term, but might be some form of that. You know, you snake in the grass. Do what you came for. But he didn't. Do what you came for, friend. How much that must have hurt Judas later to realize that he betrayed one true friend that he had. Jesus still loved Judas. He still loved Peter after he denied him. He still loved everybody. And that was not all. If we go on with the story, verse 51 and following, it says, "With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword." Matthew doesn't tell us that it's Peter. Maybe he's like, I don't know if I should throw Peter under the bus, but he reaches for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Matthew doesn't tell us that his name is Malchus. I think Malchus must have become a friend because Mark tells us his name. Why would we need to know his name unless he was somebody that the early church knew? So he cuts off the servant of the high priest's ear. And Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" 12 legions of angels. In Jesus' time, the superpower of the world was Rome, uncontested at that time. If you got Rome's ire up, you knew that you were in trouble. It was dangerous to go against Rome, and that's why they were in control in Israel. If they were upset with you, they would send a legion to attack you. Eventually, when a false Messiah came up and did rebel against Rome, they sent 2 legions, and they destroyed Judea. They razed the temple to the ground, and they killed even the last 70 zealots that holed up in the Masada fortress. Well, they didn't kill them because as they were breaking down the walls, all of them commit suicide because it was no small thing to go against Rome. They would send you a legion or 2 legions with like maybe 6,000 soldiers in each legion. And Jesus said, "You don't have to fight for me, Peter. Don't you realize God could send 12 legions of angels if I asked him to?" Do some more math today. 6,000, 12. We're talking over 70,000 angels. You think they could do some damage on this earth? Jesus could have said, "There's not a righteous person on this earth. I'm tired of this. They're making fun of me when I'm trying to save them. They're killing me when I came to rescue them. That's it. I don't have any obligation anymore." And he didn't. He had no moral reason that he had to go to the cross. And he could have just said, "God, I decided I'm not going to do this. Let's just wipe them out. And let's be content without him." Jesus doesn't need us. He had no obligation to us. And yet, he said to Peter, "I could have called the angels." The 70,000 angels wouldn't have been a big deal for God. He's got 100 million of them just around the throne. He could have sent 70,000, and they could have laid waste to this whole world. But then how could it happen that the scriptures would be fulfilled and that say it must happen in this way? Jesus died willingly. This tells us that it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a miscalculation. It wasn't by force. Jesus said, "No one took my life. I lay it down." He died willingly. Jesus stopped Peter from fighting for him and said, "I could get all the soldiers I want from heaven." And he took the man's ear and he healed it. He even healed Malchus's ear. And I think that may be why this guy became a Christian, if my guess is right. I just think when Mark tells us who the guy's name is, it's because some of the ones who read knew who Malchus was. And he must have given his life to Christ. He had compassion even on this temple soldier who was sent to arrest him. You would think Jesus would say, "There's my enemy." But he loved Malchus too. And he couldn't see him going on through life without an ear. And he healed his ear. The point of Jesus' death was love for sinners. Like Peter, like Malchus, like Judas. Jesus loved them all. Ezekiel 18:23 talks about God's heart. Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the sovereign Lord? Rather, am I not pleased when they turn from their ways and live? One day we won't be able to survive and live without God. One day hell will be the only alternative to an eternity with God. But that's not what God wants for you or for me or for any of us. He takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants us to turn from our ways and live. Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While they were sinning against him, he died for them. While they drove nails in his hands, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I marvel at that, and I think that's the most amazing love I've ever heard of. But it just makes sense, doesn't it? Because what's the whole point of the cross? It's to save those people. And I just wonder how many of them got saved. The soldier that saw Jesus die on the cross and he said, surely this is the Son of God. Something changed in his heart too. Back to Matthew 26:55. In that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Jesus said, they're going to strike the shepherd. The sheep are going to scatter. Peter's like, no, I won't. I'm out of here. And he leaves. They all left him in his hour of need. I think this section shows us that the Jewish authorities and the disciples showed cowardice. Jesus looks at these soldiers and he said, why didn't you arrest me in the daytime? Am I leading a rebellion? Do I have armed insurrectionists? Do I have an army around me? Every day I was there in the temple courts. Why didn't you arrest me then? He knows it and they know it. It's because they were afraid. They, with all the power, seemingly, were afraid of this one man. They had to arrest him at night. And then when they arrested Jesus, the disciples took off, left him to his fate. They were scared. I understand, but Jesus still loved them. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is the testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit on his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you? So they take him to Caiaphas, the high priest, and it's time for the Jewish trial. This is where they're really deciding, what to charge him with, because they know that Pilate doesn't care anything about their Jewish religion or anything else, but they're showing their own people, this is why we have to get this man killed in any way we can. And so they're like, let's bring the witnesses and say what terrible things this man has done. And they get all these guys, these ne'er-do-well false witnesses, and get them up there to find out what's going on. And they investigate it, and none of them can agree. According to Jewish law, to be convicted of something, you have to be accused by at least 2 witnesses. And obviously, they would have to agree. So it's like, what are we going to do with this guy? We can't accuse him of anything because we can't find 2 witnesses that agree on anything. The only thing they agreed on him, the worst that they could prove, was not even a crime. Finally, 2 people agreed. Hey, I heard him say, you tear down this temple and I can rebuild it in 3 days. Now, you could say some things about that. You could say, well, that's maybe prideful. You know, it took the temple builders a long time to build that temple. How can you build it in 3 days? You could say you don't believe that. But what's the crime there? He didn't tear down the temple. He didn't even write any graffiti on it. He didn't do anything to the temple. He just said, if you tear it down, I can rebuild it. In fact, he didn't even say, I could tear it down and rebuild it. He said, if you tear it down, I can rebuild it. So even if you take that statement literally, what did he do wrong? The only thing they could accuse him of was something that wasn't even wrong. And he didn't even mean that anyway. The Gospels make clear that what he meant was his own body. If you tear down this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days. Something far more amazing than rebuilding a temple in 3 days. So the only thing they could prove was not even a crime. And so, what could they do? They had to get to the heart of the matter, what really made them angry. And that was Jesus' claim of divinity. He was claiming to be God. And so, finally, the high priest says to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. I guess they don't have any Fifth Amendment in Jewish law. If they ask you a question under oath, you have to tell them what's the truth. So he says, under oath, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And at this point, Jesus knows his time has come. After years of telling people that he healed, don't tell anybody about this healing, my time is not yet. He knows it's the hour. And he said, you said so. This is an idiomatic expression in Greek that is basically him saying, you said it. You said it. He's saying, I am the Messiah, the Son of God. But then he says something more. Here he's been so silent. He's refused to talk. He's not defending himself in any way. And here he says just enough to get himself killed. Here's what he said. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the high priest knows exactly what he's saying. Caiaphas tears his robes and says, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they say, he's worthy of death. Just a side note here, Caiaphas is one of the biblical characters that we have archaeological evidence of. They have found his burial box that was inscribed with his name. And so we know where his tomb was. We know where his burial box was. We know that Caiaphas one day died and was buried, which, not surprising. But of these 2 men, Jesus is the one with the empty tomb. But here Caiaphas says he's worthy of death. Why is that? It's because the Sanhedrin knew that Jesus was claiming to be God. They knew better than we know today what Jesus was referring to. Jesus was referring to Daniel chapter 7. And I think this is important to understand because Jesus didn't call himself the Messiah. He didn't call himself the Son of God. Maybe a few times he might have, but that was not his preferred self-term. The term he used all the time was Son of Man. And a lot of people will take that and say, well, see, Jesus is just saying he's just a human being because that's what Son of Man means in the Old Testament. It means just somebody who's human. And so he's saying he's human, and he's rejecting these other titles. Not at all. Actually, of the term Son of Man and Son of God, Son of Man is the more divine term. Because sometimes in the Old Testament, people would call a godly person a son of God. And so if you only use that term, you could say, well, he's just using that in that sense, that he's a godly man. But Son of Man could mean something different. And when Jesus says this, now we know why Jesus is using that term. Because let me read to you from Daniel chapter 7. This is a vision Daniel had of heaven and what was going on in heaven. As I looked, thrones were set in place. Not one throne, but thrones were set in place. And the Ancient of Days took his seat, God himself, sitting on the throne. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking at the beast was slain and his body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority but were allowed to live for a period of time. So you see what he's talking about here is the end of the age, when the power of Satan is destroyed, where God's sitting on his throne ready for judgment. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. And you understand what Daniel's saying? Here's somebody who looked human. He was like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. Where have we heard that before today? He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshiped him. According to Jewish faith, who is qualified for worship? Only God. The worst sin is to worship anything other than God, according to the commandments. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Here in the Old Testament, Daniel had a vision that showed that God maybe is not as simple as we think. The Bible makes it clear God is one, but here we have God on his throne, and one who looks at least like a human being approaches him, coming with the clouds of heaven. And Daniel said, he's like a son of man. He didn't know it, but he was a son of man. He was a human being who was worthy of worship, which means he's a human being who is God. There we have the picture of Jesus from Daniel 700 years before Jesus was born. So when Jesus says this, they know what he's talking about. All this time he called himself the Son of Man. They may have suspected it, but here he made it clear. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven. What could he be talking about except for this vision of Daniel? I'm going to come in the clouds, and then I'm going to sit at the right hand of my Father in heaven. That is exactly what he's saying. The Caiaphas knows it. All of the other members of the Sanhedrin know it. He tears his coat. If you claim to be God and you're not, according to Jewish law, you're worthy of death. So that brings up the question. Jesus deserves death unless he is God. And we know the answer to that. Jesus endured all of this because he had a mission. He was willing to put up with all these people. They spit on him, they struck him with their fists, and they said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" They had fun mocking him. Here is one who is dying for their sins and for the sins of the world, and they're mocking him. I am so glad that I wasn't in that room that day. How could you ever live with that once you find out the truth? What was Jesus' mission? His mission was the salvation of the world. And so that's why he was willing to put up with all of this, even though with one word he could have stopped it. He could have had his revenge immediately. Hebrews 12, 1-3 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." What was the joy set before him? He saw you being saved. And he said, I can handle it. I can go to the cross. You know, we sing that chorus, like a rose. He went to the cross thinking about us. I know people said, where do you get that from in the Bible? I get it right here from Hebrews chapter 12. The joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, when I was thinking about the title for this sermon, I called this sermon The World versus Jesus. I started off with the title, Jesus Against the World, because everybody was against him. His disciples were scattered. Judas betrayed him. The soldiers arrested him. The Sanhedrin tried him with a sham trial. They just did everything they could to destroy his life. And then they mocked him and spit on him and beat him. And so I thought, well, Jesus against the world, everyone in the world. Can you imagine how lonely that must have been? Even my friends have dropped me. Even my friends walked away. And I thought, well, Jesus against the world. There's a saying, Athanasius, one of the early church bishops, was fighting against the Arian controversy. And at times it felt like he was the only one who was holding up a biblical view of the nature of Jesus when they were discussing all this theology in the church. And one of his friends wrote to him, and he wrote, "Even if I have to be Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, I'll still stand up for what's right." And I thought about that, Jesus against the world. And then I thought, no, I can't call that the title. Because Jesus has never been against the world. So I had to make it the world versus Jesus, because they all were opposed to him. And he never gave in to the anger. He never gave in to the revenge. He never gave in to the despair of these people aren't worth it. And he loved them. He loved Peter. He loved Malchus. He loved Caiaphas. He loved the soldiers. He loved the Sanhedrin. He loved Judas. Judas went out and hanged himself after this. Peter was afraid to talk to him when he came back to life, and Jesus sat down with him and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And I believe Peter had to say it 3 times because Jesus knew he denied him 3 times. He's like, I'm going to give you 3 chances to come back from that. And he still used him as his apostle. I think if Judas had come back, I know if he had come back and repented, Jesus would have forgiven him too. I'm sure Jesus did forgive him. But Judas destroyed that relationship. In his despair, he killed himself. Jesus wouldn't have done it. But Judas decided to do it. And so, no, it's not Jesus against the world. Jesus has never been against the world. He's always been for the world. Not just in a global sense, but in an individual sense. Jesus is for you. Isn't it wonderful to know that no matter what you've done, you can't destroy his love for you? Those who drove nails into his hands, those who kissed him in betrayal, he loved them still. What can you do that could compete with that? And so all you have to do is give your life to him and he'll accept it. Let's pray.